Hello and welcome to the Nexus. Today's show, Power Hungry. Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe has finally gone, but there are still plenty of others clinging to power. Why do they do it? Here in the Nexus then, we are focusing on three things. The rise and fall of Robert Mugabe, how the father of a nation became a feared dictator. Mugabe and Mandela. Why did things turn out so differently for them? Is it a matter of personality or something else? And mind games. What makes leaders tick? Why are they so driven to stay in power, even in their 80s and 90s? We'll find out here in the Nexus. Hello, I'm Matthew Moore and welcome to the Nexus. We are looking at Robert Mugabe and how power corrupts. We've invited four experts to help us start this off. We have Ian Robertson. He is a professor of psychology who has a theory on why powerful men lose the plot. George Shire is a member of the ZANU-PF party and has known Robert Mugabe for 60 years, used to play tennis with him. Georgina Godwin is also from Zimbabwe and is a journalist. And last but not least, we have Kagiso Lediga, a comedian and satirist from South Africa. So now we are all gathered, let's look at the rise and fall of Robert Mugabe. You can accuse him of many things, but never of being ordinary. In fact, his life has been more like a Hollywood movie.
Swear that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Zimbabwe and observe the laws of Zimbabwe. So help me God.
He did genuinely want to be the savior of his people, the liberator of an oppressed nation.
Free and fair elections.
He can't face what he's done in Zimbabwe because that isn't what he intended to do.
People dying of hunger because they can't get food.
There comes a point where you're so out of touch or deluded that you might as well be mad. I think he lives in the world in a mad kind of way.
The moment the outside world starts dictating to us, we will not proceed.
I, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, hereby formally tender my resignation with immediate effect.
George, let me ask you about over the years. Did Robert Mugabe change over the years?
No, he didn't. And I think part of this is to do with how we understand the moments in Zimbabwean history. And I'm not saying that because I'm a card-carrying member of anything. Actually, in fact, it's much more to do because I'm a historian of ideas and cultural theorists, and that's how I come to it. What the moment of independence is very different from the moment of independence movement is very different from the moment of liberation struggle. It's very different from the moment of the land question. It's very different from now. So there are 3, 4, or 5 distinct stages in the life and times of Robert Mugabe.
So you don't think he lost you don't think he lost the purity of his cause as he stayed in power, the longer he stayed in power?
I think the language you use to understand it is in part the problem. If you ask me what the 1964 is like, which is the first Congress of ZANU-PF, the ZANU-PF Congress sets into motion the notion that the only way to defeat settler colonialism was what they call direct confrontation. armed struggle in that sense. In many ways, that's what makes it distinct from ZAPU. That's what called people of my generation into an affinity with it. If you talk about 1976, it's the moment in which he is directed to lead the last 5 years of the armed struggle into independence. And if you talk in the moment of the 2000 is the moment of the land distribution program. In each one of those phases, there is a line of continuity.
Okay, now George, just finally, before I come back to you very quickly, you've known him for years. You have very good contacts who are still close to Robert Mugabe. How is he now that he's out of power?
He's back in his house. As far as I know, I'm reliably informed. He's at his home. Father Munkonori, who is a respected priest in Zimbabwe, who mediated between the generals and Robert Mugabe, and George Shire, who was his spokesman, both say Robert Mugabe is very relaxed and well.
Okay, and is it true that he wept when he signed his resignation letter?
Actually, I think he did not. Father Munkonori, I don't have any reason to doubt him. He's a very reliable, respectful, leading clergyman in Zimbabwe. He says the minute Robert Mugabe signed it, he looked relaxed and happy.
Well, he would be. I mean, he's getting, apparently, a $10 million lump sum payoff. Is that true?
We need to distinguish between our caricatures and look at things as they exist, not as I would like them to be. I'm just answering the question, is he happy? And I'll say to you, my inside information tells me he's happy.
George,
why he's happy, you have to ask him, not me.
Well, maybe he needs a break after 37 years. George, we're going to come back to you in a moment. We go now to Georgina Godwin. She is a journalist from Zimbabwe. Georgina, finish this sentence for me. Robert Mugabe would still be in power if only...
I don't think he would, actually. I think Robert Mugabe would still be respected if only he had left earlier. And I think that's the main point, is that and I think George is absolutely right. We've seen Mugabe be the same person all along. This is not a good leader turned bad. This is a man who always knew what it was that he wanted and how he was going to achieve it. Unfortunately, as he failed, his wife got a lot stronger. So I guess the way that question would conventionally be answered is that if Grace hadn't tried to grab power, as we assume she did, then perhaps he would still be in place.
That is actually the right answer. No, I'm kidding. That is the answer we were looking for. It's Grace Mugabe. In many people's points of view, why do you think he was trying to create a dynasty? Why not just at 93 step down and let somebody else take over? Very dangerous strategy.
Well, it is, but it's not a new one. And if you look across Africa, there are many leaders who've done the same thing. And I think if you view elections perhaps as transactional rather than democratic, this is not just a transference of power in many cases. It's also a transference of the kleptocracy. People make a lot of money from being in power. Why would you step down, particularly if you can then be prosecuted for robbing your country, which is exactly what Mugabe has done.
Okay.
I think that throws up a lot of difficulties for the next lot of people who, of course, can't be accountable. People
at home can see that George Shire is shaking his head, but we have to give everyone a chance. George, just give me a second. We're going to go to Ian Robertson now. He is a professor of psychology. Let's start with just the legacy idea and the idea of trying to create a dynasty, which some people say Robert Mugabe was trying to do, handing power over to Grace Mugabe. Is that something you see amongst these types of leaders, that it's not enough that they have power, they want to transfer it?
Yes, no human being can cope with having absolute power for 37 years. In fact, after about 10 years, it's almost inevitable. There are a few exceptions that people become mentally very, very changed and personality-wise very changed by power.
But the point of dynasty, I mean, Robert, Ian.
Yes. But so one of the features of that is an extreme narcissism and egocentricity, where you begin to believe that you are so special that the country the country will fall apart without you. And so your genetic or your family closest person becomes the nearest way in which you can evade mortality by having this almost godlike specialness transferred. So most dictators will try and find a family member to create a dynasty.
I see. Okay, Ian, we're
a way of continuing an inflated ego.
We're going to come back to you in just a second. Let's hop over to South Africa now, and we have Kagiso there waiting. What is the view from South Africa of Mugabe?
Well, it's quite hopeful, but we sort of don't know because it seems to be more of the same, because this is his deputy president of a few weeks ago or a few months ago who kind of, it seems like it was a revenge move that happened sort of suddenly. I feel like if Grace Mugabe hadn't overplayed her hand, we would still have Mugabe in power, and this guy, would still remain. Emerson Mnangagwa would still be the deputy president. I feel like there's, I'm waiting to see. I think everybody's kind of waiting to see what's going to happen. Well, we're giving it a few weeks, a few months, you never know. But let's because Zimbabweans are great people, very educated people who are attending gardens and working as domestic workers.
You mentioned
the situation in their country.
You mentioned Emerson Mnangagwa, and actually we want to go back now to George Shire for a moment and just find out a little bit about him. They call him the crocodile. There are a lot of theories about this, about him being a stealthy predator or whatever, but you have the real answer, George.
Well, I wanted to respond to the other three
bits. No, please don't, George. Let's stick with Mnangagwa. We need to move on. We may come back and double back on that in a second. You just have to tell us how he got his name, the crocodile.
I will do. Don't worry. Patience. Relax. I will do. Okay. So the word crocodile was a member of the crocodile gang, which is formed out of the moment I described earlier, the making direct confrontation as the only way to defeat colonial settlers. It was called the crocodile gang. They went into Zimbabwe, tried to combat, and all of them were captured. They were sentenced to death. All the members were all the other members were hanged, except Mnangagwa because he was below 21. That name, crocodile, ascribes the heroic to him. Okay?
Okay.
Now, that's one. The second thing is, the use now is somehow to make him a demon is something else. And we need to think about what that designation is about. It has nothing to do with what it does every day. It's more to do with putting on, it's another level of demonization, ironically, which is what is played out on the body of Robert Mugabe for most of the last 37 years.
All right, George, thank you very much. Just briefly go back to Georgina now. The crocodile, is this a clean break for Zimbabwe or more of the same? Just briefly.
It's not a clean break in any way. Mnangagwa is very, very closely allied to Mugabe. I think what's happened is a coup visited upon our own people, in that everybody is now hailing Mnangagwa and the army as the saviours. They won't need to rig the next election. It doesn't matter how closely it's monitored. They will probably win, and I'm afraid Zimbabwe's in for more of the same.
All right,
there is a very small window, though, and he could run with this and make the country fabulous. That's what I hope he does.
All right, we shall see if Mugabe epitomised bad leadership, for some at least. Surely Nelson Mandela in neighbouring South Africa is at the other end of the spectrum. Such a contrast. Why is it that one has been vilified and isolated for years, while the other has become more like a saint, respected by nearly everyone?
We will never see the likes of Nelson Mandela again.
When Nelson Mandela died, it was as if the whole world were in mourning. Close to 100 leaders attended his funeral in South Africa, including President Barack Obama.
He makes me want to be a better man. He speaks to what's best inside us.
Also attending on that rainy day 4 years ago, Zimbabwe's President Robert Mugabe. The two men were born just 6 years apart and took similar paths for a while. Both attended Christian missionary schools and both became professionals. Mandela a lawyer, Mugabe a teacher. Both were part of the armed struggle to end white minority rule in their respective countries, but had different challenges.
You are just fighting for the removal of apartheid. Not for independence as freedom and independence as we were doing.
Both men were imprisoned, Mandela for 27 years, Mugabe for 11.
When I was released, the media said that this is the end of Mugabe from the point of view of popularity. In fact, he himself didn't want me to come out of jail.
The difference between the two men became increasingly clear once they were in charge. Mandela preaching national unity and reconciliation,
Democracy and freedom for all.
while Mugabe, who ordered the violent seizure of white-owned farms, accused Madiba of being too kind to whites.
I asked one ANC minister how come the whites have been left with so much power, and he said it was because of your friend Mandela.
But it was Mandela who was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, while Mugabe has been repeatedly accused of human rights abuses.
We are not gays.
But perhaps the greatest difference comes at the end. Mandela choosing to step down after just one term as president, still loved and respected. Mugabe finally forced out of office after 37 years. Many people glad to see the back of him.
Well, kind of contrast. Let's go to Georgina Godwin now. You're a Zimbabwean journalist, as we mentioned at the top. When you were observing the two men, what is the biggest difference between them?
Well, I think, as your tape just pointed out, the fact that Mandela was prepared to go, but also that he attempted to make life as good for all of his citizens as possible. He was not in it for personal enrichment. South Africa thrived under him, and ordinary farmers, and I'm talking about peasant farmers here. I'm sorry, I'm just going to take that again. South Africa thrived under him, and ordinary people did extremely well. In Zimbabwe, you were looking at a culture of personal enrichment for the leadership, which was entirely different. And then, of course, choosing to go after that first term was an enormous thing. He was a great man, Mandela, and I think that Truth and Reconciliation Commission really helped too.
And
unfortunately, in Zimbabwe, there can now be no accountability.
Let's give the people of Zimbabwe a chance now. We have some sound bites from a few of them. They seem quite happy that Mugabe went.
Our country is going to be different, and our relations all over the world are going to be normalized.
We fought the 2017 war, and we are happy that Mugabe is gone, and is gone for good. Happy New Zimbabwe!
No corruption, no stealing, no cheating, and no dictatorship in the country. This is what we are looking at.
A very big,
I'm happy, especially for us, all generations.
A very big achievement, my brother. I'm happy. Very big.
Well, let's go back to George just briefly. George, can you explain, towards the end there, it seemed like everybody erupted in joy that Mugabe was going. That's nothing to do with Mugabe, you're saying, it's to do with having a change?
No, in both questions. What one needs to do is to see what is it that begins to happen inside ZANU since 2014. What's happened in Zimbabwe, in my view, is ZANU tidying itself up. And I think Georgina is right in that sense, that the music is still the same. There hasn't been a change institutionally. Zimbabwe, Botswana, Angola, Mozambique, South Africa, and Tanzania are still run by the same political institutions. Okay. Wait a minute, that grew out of independence movement. So there's no change in that way. But if you're talking about, if you want to talk about, we can talk about post-Mugabe as a periodization, but as an analytic tool, it doesn't explain anything.
We're going to bring Ian Robertson in for a moment. He's the Professor of Psychology joining us from UND. Ian, we just wanted to compare Mugabe and Mandela. Some people say it's an unfair comparison because of the circumstances. What have you noticed about the two men?
Well, Mandela was a man who seemed to feel his ego was kept in check by a sense of there being something greater than him, a moral code or a commitment to his people. One of the protections against great power is the feeling that you are not the end of everything, that you are not so special, and that you feel constrained by a legal or moral framework that's greater than you. Perhaps as a result of being in prison for so long, perhaps as a result of being older, he came out and he was protected against the drug-like effects of power, because power acts in exactly the same parts of the brain that cocaine and heroin act on, and it becomes addictive and it changes people's brains. He was one protection against that is having ethical and higher standards to which you feel subservient. So a combination of that and his age and the fact that he'd been so in prison for so long meant that he had he'd been given an antidote to the drug of power to some extent, whereas Mugabe had virtually unfettered power for 37 years, and no human being in the world can survive that without becoming corrupt, becoming dishonest, becoming delusional, and losing all self-awareness.
Ian, we're going to come back to all of our panel in just a moment, the last segment of the show. Mugabe's just one of dozens of leaders, of course, right around the world who just can't let go. This week, Bolivia's Evo Morales announced he'd run for a 4th consecutive term in 2019. In a moment, we'll look at the impact power has on the mind. But first, a little quiz for you. Could you name Africa's longest-serving leaders? Here's our current top 5.
Africa's democratic progress is also at risk when leaders refuse to step aside when their terms end.
In at 5, Idris Deby, president of Chad for 27 years. He led a rebel group against the government seizing power in 1990, the same year that Saddam Hussein ordered the invasion of Kuwait. There have been several attempts to oust the 65-year-old, but he says he's going nowhere. At 4, Omar al-Bashir, president of Sudan for 28 years. As a young soldier, he ousted a democratically elected government in '89 and has outlasted 4 American presidents. Will he manage a 5th? At 73, Bashir shows no signs of stepping down, despite being wanted for alleged war crimes. At 3, hats off to Yoweri Museveni, president of Uganda for 31 years. This one-time rebel helped topple 2 presidents, including Idi Amin, before seizing power in '86, the same year Mexico hosted the World Cup. He may be 73, but he believes he's young and energetic enough to go on and on.
You should worry about me being in the struggle for too long.
At 2, Paul Biya, president of Cameroon for 35 years. He moved from being PM to president in '82, around the time Michael Jackson released his groundbreaking Thriller video. And he's still there, still thrilling. At 84 years old, he shows no sign of wanting to step down. And at number 1, Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasogo, president of Equatorial Guinea for 38 years. Obiang overthrew his own uncle in a coup back in '79, the same year Margaret Thatcher became Britain's first woman prime minister. He outlasted her and 4 of her successors, possibly a 5th coming up. The 75-year-old has won elections with no less than 90% of the vote, so the odds of him letting go of the reins anytime soon are pretty remote.
Well, let's go back to Ian very briefly. Ian, we've got a whole selection of people there. We also mentioned Evo Morales. Were it not for the Constitution, probably a number of American presidents would want to go on and on and on. You were mentioning a little bit about what is the common factor here, the addictiveness of power. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, power is probably the most potent pharmaceutical agent in the world. And so they get more and more power, and it is exactly the same mechanism as it is for addiction, where you need more and more to achieve the same effects. And we know what kind of distorting effects addiction to drugs has on people's behavior. It decreases their morals. It makes them not feel bad about doing bad things to others. Power does that as well.
I want to go back to George Shire for a moment. George, I see you have little room for, or little time rather, for this sort of analysis. But I would like you just to tell me a little bit about the strength, the staying power of Robert Mugabe. He's 93 years of age, and you say you've met him still, and he's as sharp as anything.
There is something very, very, very wrong about how you said this discussion. Psychoanalysis, psychobiographies, psychobubbles need decolonization. And this is a very serious critique. Okay, I understand what Robinson is talking about. I'm a theorist after all. It is a lot of junk to look at it that way. Okay, what do you need to understand in the first place? It's what kinds of power we're talking about. Some people aren't stupid, you know. You have to allow them agency. You have to ask yourself, what is it that made them continue to vote for this guy? What is it that made them change their minds?
Wait a minute, let's go to Kagiso in South Africa. Kagiso, you want to come in?
Yeah, I just wonder, I mean, did the Zimbabwean people continue to vote for this guy? Is it really so? You can't just say, oh yeah, the people of Zimbabwe voted for this guy. 37, I mean, I'm 39 years old. There are people my age who only had one president. That is, you know, you can say, yeah, I agree with what you're saying about the sort of these post-colonial African government. The ANC has been in power in South Africa since Nelson Mandela in 1994. But you also have to agree that because of its failings, the opposition in South Africa is thriving. If you go and watch South African Parliament, it's a thriving thing. Nobody is violating the opposition. We are not seeing people getting hit in the street by the police because they were saying something against the government.
Kagiso, Lediga, we haven't heard much from you, so I'm glad you got the last word there. Thank you so much for joining us from South Africa. Georgina Godwin, thank you also for your contribution. George, I know you needed more time. I'm sorry we haven't got it, but thank you for joining us. And Ian Robertson, thank you also for joining us as well. Well, that is it for this week. Next week, Donald Trump calls him Little Rocket Man. North Koreans call him Supreme Leader. You know who he is. See you then, and thank you for watching.